Last week we started talking about the 23rd Psalm and about how very often even people who haven't been to church for 100 years still remember and still love those words and love the promise that is within them. The Lord is my shepherd. He makes me to lie down in green pastures. He leads me beside the still waters. He restores my soul. And we talked about how every human being wants some green pastures and some still waters, particularly in a time of grief or loss or sickness. It still means so much. Today I want to talk about a hymn that means an awful lot to people, even if they haven't been to church in 100 years or so. When general populations of people are surveyed and you ask them, what is your favorite hymn? And this includes non-church goers. They always come out with two that are the tops. And you can think about it for a moment and see if you get it right. The two are Amazing Grace, which I think people know just because it's used in so many different contexts outside of the church even. But the other one is How Great Thou Art. And one of the verses in there says, when through the woods and forest glades I wander, and hear the birds sing sweetly in the trees, when I look down from lofty mountain grandeur, and hear the brook, and feel the gentle breeze, then sings my soul. And it's really clear that there is something within the human heart that genuinely yearns for and craves some kind of new contact with the world that God has created. Why is that hymn so loved? Again, even by people outside of the church who have no intention of ever coming into a church, they all want to sing. When through the woods and forest glades I wander. It may just be that we live in a society that is so fast-paced and so competitive, and there is such a mentality of fear and insecurity and scarcity, and maybe because we are all chained to our social media outlets all the time, there is never a place to rest, to stop, to gather one's soul together. We're afraid that if we stop for a moment, the world will overtake us and we will lose the race. And so we yearn for the woods and the forest glades and the wandering, and we yearn again to have a soul that remembers how to sing. That fast pace has negative and destructive effects on the human soul and on human society. It creates within us a lack of compassion, a lack of feeling, and a lack of understanding for the hurt and the brokenness of other human beings. When we live constantly at that fast pace, we lose our connection to other people. We certainly lose our connection to God. We lose our sense of living in community. And instead of being human beings living and sharing and caring, sort of like what the early church was, we become human beings who are just individual and turned inwards, living for ourselves. We wonder if there is some kind of a remedy for that we would turn outwards again with compassion and thoughtfulness for other human beings. Back in the year 1982, there was a young man who lived in a tremendously stressful society. A society that was totally success-oriented and accomplishment-oriented, and he began to become sick. And he went to many doctors with all of his symptoms. He had a tremendously high sense of stress. His blood pressure was high. His heart rate was racing. He had lost all of his sense of well-being, all of his sense of the joy of being alive. And he finally went to a doctor and said, "You've got to give me something. I've tried everything. You've got to write me a prescription and give me a pill that's going to cure me because my life is miserable." And the doctor was quite elderly. And he said, "Fine, I'll write you a prescription." And he got out his pad and he wrote out a prescription for that young man, and he folded it up and he gave it to him. And the young man didn't look at it. He went to the drugstore and he marched up to the prescription counter and he put it on the counter and he said to the pharmacist, "Give me this stuff." And the pharmacist opened up the note and he says, "What do you mean, give you this stuff?" And he handed the note back to the young man, and all that the doctor had written on it was, "Go for a slow walk in the forest." And the young man thought it was a cruel joke. And he went back to the doctor and he complained, and the doctor said, "Do as I have told you." And the young man went for a slow walk in the forest. And it was the beginning of a significant movement in the nation of Japan that has spread worldwide since, going for a walk in the forest as a prescription. And in fact, the young man found that his blood pressure was reduced, his stress level was reduced, his heart rate went down, and his sense of well-being, his sense of the joy of living, returned to him. There are names for it. Forest bathing, or being in the presence of trees. The Japanese term is shinrin yoku. It's not the same as hiking. You can't hike, because hiking has to it a beginning and an end and a sense of accomplishment. You aren't there to accomplish anything. There's no counting steps. You cannot take your Fitbit with you. There can be no speed, no accomplishment, no competition, and it requires, or rather demands, minimal effort. It is simply being in the presence of trees. You should all look it up when you get home. It's a weird thing. There are physical explanations for why it works. Trees produce a compound known as phytoncide, which is an antimicrobial allelochemic volatile organic compound that the trees produce to protect themselves for disease, but they produce it in such abundance that it fills the whole atmosphere, and it happens to have the same protective effect for human beings. Of course, long before Shinrin Yoku became something in Japan, other people had figured that out. Henry David Thoreau, when he wrote on Walden Pond in 1854, stated his purpose in going down to live by Walden Pond was to live life with the essentials. Because he felt caught up in the rat race of daily living, even in 1854, and he began to think to himself, I don't want to get to the end of my life and think that I have missed on all the things that were most important. Many Christian songwriters have figured out the power of being in the presence of trees. After the sermon, we are going to sing the hymn by Carl Gustav Boberg, How Great Thou Art. And you can all sing out, When through the woods and forest glades. And when the children come in, we're going to close up with one that maybe some of you remember if you're really, really old. Written, there's no old people. I forgot. Luella Cole, and she wrote, birds are singing, woods are ringing, joyfully give praise to thee. So some of you know that one. And you get this weird question. Walden Pond, written in 1854, How Great Thou Art, 1885, Birds Are Singing, 1840. What is it about the latter part of the 19th century that is making all these people want to experience God's creation in nature again? What happened? And you're all historians, so you know that the very peak of the Industrial Revolution was the year 1840, in about there, in which mechanization was pushing human beings aside and creating societies where human beings did not have to gather together in community, but instead we relied on machines and technologies. And in that, human beings were devalued and separated, and society was broken down. I know you think that's all tremendously interesting. Some of you might be saying, but how does it connect to the gospel of the life and the death and the resurrection of Jesus Christ? And Mark, why on earth do you have this tent and this river and the worst looking artificial tree anyone has ever seen? Well, they're only symbols, okay? This to help in with the kids program. But if being in the presence of trees reminds us of our place in creation, then in fact that healing effect that the trees have is not only because of the compounds they produce or because of some physical phenomenon, but because of a spiritual phenomenon whereby all of us need to be brought back into connection with God through His creation. And today we live in a society where everything is paved, everything is mechanized. There are children who will grow up, they will never know what a farm is. They will never know what it is to put their hands into the soil and feel the goodness and the richness and the moisture. They will grow up completely disconnected from the natural world, and because of that, completely disconnected from the God who is revealed in Jesus Christ. The artificial world creates an artificial life of separation and individuality. And the end result is that we are all dehumanized, disconnected, made unable to live in relationship or community. We grow up with this sense of scarcity and of competitiveness because we do not recognize the endless bounty and the goodness that is available within nature. And human society is profoundly diminished. We as the church have as part of our mission to bring people back into connection with God, in part back into connection with nature, to end that dehumanizing, disconnecting effect. Our task is to create loving communities where human beings appreciate each other and love each other. Long before Shinrin Yoku, and long before Henry David Thoreau, or Boberg, who wrote How Great Thou Art, or Luella Cole, who wrote Birds Are Singing, God gave us the insight in the prophet Isaiah. The trees will shout for joy. And long before Isaiah was ever written, 1 Chronicles 16:33, the trees will sing for joy to the Lord. In Psalm 19, the trees will clap their hands and the trees will whisper the name of God from one to the other. In Acts 2:43 to 47, and that's the passage the children are looking at today, we hear about the Christian community at its beginning. Human beings who were connected to each other, living in a community that included all kinds of different people. All the people whom the Roman Empire had pushed away, all the people who were strange or different or broken or minority, they all came together in the Christian church. And there they were recognized as equal and valuable and people with great dignity. I don't think that we can reproduce everything about the early Christian church. To do that, the first thing you would all have to do would be to bring all your money to the church, empty all your bank accounts, sell all of your property, close down all of your investments, and then we would have to come and live together as a community. Likely you aren't going to do that. I wouldn't stop you. But we can recreate some aspects of that community where all people, regardless of who they are or what they look like, are accepted and loved and deemed to be of equal value. To live in a society where there is no competitiveness, no competition, no sense that one has achieved more than the other or is worth more than another. And we need that. We need what God brings us, what the world of nature teaches us. We need it more today than ever before. As an illustration, just yesterday in Charlottesville, Virginia, there was a massive rally of white nationalists. People whose greatest complaint is that the world is no longer run by white males. And when others showed up, when persons of color, when women, when persons who wanted an inclusive community showed up, the rally turned violent to the point of death. What has happened that there are still places in a civilized world where there are people who will not recognize that the human community must involve all humans, and that we cannot divide on the basis of color or religion or ethnicity or any other dividing factor. We all need to go for a walk in the forest. Maybe get some of those compounds that the trees give off. But more than that, remember again our place in God's creation, the wonder of God's goodness, the wonder that is brought to us fully in Jesus Christ, in whose life and death and resurrection we see the value of all humankind. For his name's sake, amen. So let us see what Dave Mitchell is going to do today.
Thanks very much, Mark. This Thursday is our annual Pickling Bee, and our motto this year is, "It's crunch time." So if you've been delaying in volunteering to help out, we've got 4 bushels of fresh Ontario-grown beets that will be picked up on Thursday morning. And between the hours of 10 and 2, if you can help out in the kitchen, an apron would help if you bring one along. If you don't, we'll supply one. And we're going to pickle those beets in preparation for the Heather and Holly Bazaar, our Christmas Bazaar on December 2nd. So if you would like to help out, please let Karen Wagner know, and you can look at the contact information in the bulletin. And this morning, just a short song. You probably remember the song On Broadway. They say the neon lights are bright on Broadway. Remember, it's sort of call and answer. But this is not on Broadway, this is on Thursday. They say there is a pickling bee on Thursday, on Thursday. St. Andrew's Kitchen, come by bus or car. 4 bushels of fresh beets to do. We'll boil, cut, and add dill spice too. We'll store them all away for the bazaar. Key change. They say I will get purple hands on Thursday, on Thursday. The purple washes off the memory stain. We'll laugh and we'll enjoy the task. Now let me ask you, what more could you ask? A sense of satisfaction on that day. Key change. They say that I won't last too long on Thursday, on Thursday. I'll catch the LRT for home, they say. But they're dead wrong, I know they are, 'cause I can fill these mason jars. And I will be a pickling star on Thursday. On Thursday. On Thursday. On Thursday. Fade out. On Thursday. On Thursday. On Thursday. On Thursday. See you on Thursday.
Go